Thank you, Chairman, for inviting me and for your kind words. It's nice to be back among friends. I do, as you say, have a new hat on, a hat that's only a few weeks old, on behalf of the European Foundation for Financial Inclusion, founded in 2010 to promote financial access to financial services across the board, but including, of course, choice of payment options and basic bank accounts. I've been asked to help a new stage of development. I'm very glad to do it. I have three basic points to make. First, about growth and the single market, because that's the focus of this part of the session. Secondly, about the basic payment account and what it should consist. And thirdly, the case for a mandatory approach. We very much share the criticisms of Mrs. Gebhardt and others on the present soft approach, but clearly the case for a mandatory approach has to be made and won, and I hope to contribute to that. The social case for a basic payment account, of course, for up to 30 million people, probably more, in fact, is clear, but there are also strong pro-growth and pro-single market arguments for such a facility. First, I think it now is well established and well known in Europe at least that growth is best and most effective when it's inclusive, when everyone can contribute to economic development according to their own abilities and capacities, and access to financial services is essential for that. It's also, without going into all the complications of the articles of the treaty, it's also a very important universal access to services of general interest is an important European Union objective, and it's an important contributor to growth in the way in which we grow in Europe. But we can't achieve full access to services of general interest without access to appropriate means of payment. Universal access will be incomplete if we can't pay for the services, if we don't have good means of doing so. It's also the case, we talk of 30 million, as I said, there are probably more because there are difficulties of methodology and measuring who is without basic bank account. But if we think of the 30 million, they are not all helpless victims. Many of them, we must believe that most of them, but very many of them, have a potential for innovation, for entrepreneurship, and for contributing to economic and social development. And yet, again, they will be handicapped in doing so without access to payments. We mustn't assume that economic growth only comes from those with large capital or with large means already at their disposal. We know that growth should, in time, increase the numbers of those who can be a source of profit to the banks. But how long do we have to wait? Progress will come very slowly if we wait until banks are prepared to provide bank accounts to increasing numbers of people. Growth will become sooner if people have bank accounts sooner. And also in the single market context, it's a very obvious point, payments and cash withdrawals across borders within the EU are complex, expensive, and in fact in most cases impossible without access to payment accounts. On the basic payment account, we certainly welcome the account as proposed by the Commission, but think it does not go far enough. For most of the people who are particularly suffering from financial exclusion, the capacity to deposit and to withdraw cash will remain very important for a long time to come. So we will have to look at that in terms of access to ATMs or arrangements for making cash deposits. And the recommendation is very incomplete on this point. There are other issues which other speakers have mentioned to expand the definition of basic bank account, which I will not go into here. Some people, I think, even by implication, that somehow Internet and online banking is the answer, but this will not achieve financial inclusion for the foreseeable future. We're a long way from achieving universal Internet access, but the problem is particularly acute among the financial and socially excluded. Indeed, for some time, Internet and online banking is likely to widen the gap between those with a bank account and those without. Of course, it's not all the fault of the banks, so to speak. While we have to make basic payment accounts available, steps also are needed to promote take-up among those who need or want such accounts and who don't have access to basic banking. So steps to encourage outreach would be very important, whether by public authorities, NGOs, but also by the banks themselves. They shouldn't just sit there passively, wait to be, but also try to encourage outreach. And it's important, too, that the basic payment accounts are configured in terms of accessibility, ease of use, and affordability to promote maximum take-up. Finally, the case for a mandatory approach. Not for micromanagement, of course, at European level, but certainly for a binding approach which takes into account which allows member states to take into account their own circumstances. In the impact assessment of the Commission, for example, they talk about a framework regulation. I'm not going to get into which article or anything like that, but something along these lines is necessary. But why mandatory at all? Well, first, banks are not going to make money from basic accounts for some time. They may make more money than they pretend at the moment, by the way, but particularly if they provide them at marginal cost. But the fact of the matter is it's not the most profitable thing they can do with their resources at the moment. And so a non-binding instrument is likely to be ineffective. It carries with it also the risk of promoting free riders and distortions of competition. There's very clear evidence that recommendations and soft law do not work in this context. For example, in relation to payment services, in relation to mortgage information, in relation to bank fees, and more recently in relation to the recommendation on legal tender. And the recommendation on basic payments accounts will be similarly ineffective. I was struck by the evidence of some former colleagues, the main consumer organisation in Germany, VZBV, in their evidence to the consultation. It's also in the impact assessment, where they pointed out that there has been a soft law approach in Germany since 1996, 16 years, but it has not achieved its aims. They also pointed out one even more interesting thing. There are some Länder where, for complicated reasons, there is, in fact, a binding approach to basic bank accounts. And in those Länder, the success is better than in those Länder where there is not such a binding arrangement. More generally, recommendations in soft law, they've worked sometimes, limited results in specific sectors in some member states. Some of them work quite well in the UK. But these results cannot be replicated across all the member states because there are very different approaches and traditions to soft law and to recommendations and to codes of practice in different member states. Binding measures can work because all states are subject to the rule of law. Binding measures also are favoured by those with most experience of working with the financially or socially excluded. And let's take an example. Let us say I am older even than I am. I want a bank account. I go to a bank. Bank manager, it's obvious that I'm not going to be a source of great profit. Not very attractive. Well, how can I convince the bank manager that he or she should open an account for me? I could say, oh, you have to. There's a recommendation from the European Commission in Brussels. But I don't think that would be very effective. Or I could say, there's a law, and that would be effective. But going back on the issue of evidence, there have been so many recommendations in this area, followed then by binding measures, that the evidence is very clear. I don't understand the Commission's commitment, in this case, or decision in favour of a recommendation. It seems a bit like the experience of some, not all, some second marriages. It's the triumph of hope over experience. Finally, Chairman, to summarise, basic bank accounts will contribute to inclusive growth, to universal access, to single market, payments across borders. that we need specific provisions to strengthen the basic payment account, to go further than the Commission has defined it. And finally, the case for a mandatory approach is overwhelming. Thank you, Chairman.